So some years ago, as Suzanne mentioned, I published a book entitled World Fairs Italian Style that looked at the World Fairs that was held in Turin 1911 as the last of the great World Fairs before World War I. And the book framed the Italian exhibition within the golden age of World's Fairs from 1850 approximately to 1914, and compared it to the grand World Fairs. You see them on this slide. Of course, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations in London, famous for its Crystal Palace in 1851, the Exposition Universelle in Paris, 1889, which brought us the Tour Eiffel, and Vienna, Austria in 1873 with its iconic rotunda. Now, all these World's Fairs were devoted to nation building, to the display of power and national identity. And what is remarkable is that in this World's Fair, apparently contradictory outcomes were aligned side by side. Cosmopolitanism, the bringing of all nations together, coexisted with imperial aggression. Universal brotherhood, or at least the notion of universal brotherhood, coexisted with ruthless colonial conquest. The best way I found to perhaps quickly define the era was actually from a reporter at the time who called this age the age of peace armed to the teeth. Italy was very much a belated actor in the stage of the nations and empires. The country was predominantly still agrarian, and it was driven economically by the industrialized Piedmont and Lombardy region. And from this region, Turin took it upon itself of hosting the 1911 World's Fair. And the World Fairs was meant to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the so-called unification of Italy under the Savoy crown, with Turin as the capital city of the Kingdom of Italy. And Turin then took it upon itself to achieve the task that Massimo d'Azeglio, you see it in the title, himself a Turinese statesman, had identified when he said, "L'Italia è fatta, restano da fare gli italiani." Italy has been made, but we need to make Italians. So today, what I want to do is present what I call the sequel to my book, which is a pretty extensive digital project. And as I present this digital project to you, exemplify how it's one of its applications via two case studies, that of Italy and that of Hungary compared. So the World Fairs of Turin 1911 took place between April 29 and November 19th, 1911. It covered more than 250,000 square meters in the Park of the Valentino in downtown Turin. 37 nations participated, and the fair attracted more than 7 million visitors. As you can see from the map of the exposition, all of the national exhibitions had the prime locations on the river banks of the Po River that crosses Turin, and then you had, if you look on the right side, a little bit separate, there were the amusement parks and the so-called colonial exhibits. And we'll talk a little bit about this distinction moving on. But after I completed my book and I was looking again at the map, the question I asked myself is, how can I bring this map to life? It became very clear that the printed page had some limitations, and so had the single authored book, which was obviously very much limited by my disciplinary training. And, you know, all the pavilions were dismantled. There's not a single pavilion that has been left standing. All the artifacts, all the architectural buildings, all the elements of the fairs were either returned to archives, museums, individual private collectors, or simply lost. So, so phase 2 of my project began really when I came to UC San Diego. UC San Diego was ideal in a sense because it allowed me to partner with the Jacobs School of Engineering, and in particular with the Cultural Heritage Engineering Initiative at the Qualcomm Institute. And at the same time, I was able to develop stronger partnership with the architecture school in the Politecnico di Torino, to create a digital project that would combine the collection and curation of numberless archival materials that I've been collecting throughout the years with the 3D reconstruction of individual pavilions. That obviously required very technical skills that include photogrammetry, 3D reconstruction, accurate mapping, and so forth, that are purview of architects and engineers and not literary and historical scholars. So I was able to partner with these collaborators in the creation of this ongoing project. And I must say, I also received a great deal of support from my colleagues at Geisel Library in the special collections for the appropriate cataloging of artifacts and all digitized archival materials and architectural drawings, but especially in the GIS and data lab, where I worked with Amy Work, who helped us with tools to accurately visualize geospatial data. So as I began gathering materials, there were some unexpected finds. One that I want to share with you now is a documentary that was made in 1911 and gives you a sense of the exposition, the fairgrounds, as it was being built. And this has been possible through the Museo del Cinema in Torino. Many of you will know Cinecittà as the seat of Italian filmmaking in Italy, but in reality, the film industry was born in Turin. It wasn't born in Rome. And we were lucky enough to be able to retrieve this extraordinary documentary. It's very slow because it was made in 1911. So it's certainly not the quick pace we are used to, but I'll let you enjoy, and obviously there is no sound to it. I'll let you enjoy it, and I'll just chime in occasionally to identify some of the sites and the pavilions as you see them. So you see them mostly under construction, still scaffolding. So we're looking probably fall, early winter here. There was a massive snowstorm that slowed the construction. So that makes me think it's before that. If you saw only completed pavilion on the left that we just saw. That was, it's the only one who shows the color. Most of the pavilion, I would say 90% of the pavilion were white stucco, of course, and that why the exhibition was also called La Bianca Valentina, the white Valentine from the location, and white because it was a dazzling display of bright whites. Everything made of wood, stucco, everything made to be dismantled after the months of the exhibition. As I said, no standing pavilion exists today, and no building was built with the intention of being maintained. This is one of the temporary bridges that were built on the River Po. Of course, there are some bridges that stand today, and there are the bridges that are historical, but because of the flow of fairgoers, a number of temporary bridges were built. This was one of them, leading to the pavilion of the Italians abroad. I said 90% of the pavilion were white and made in a style that I will discuss shortly, called Turinese Baroque, il Barocco Turinese. But some of them, we are seeing what was called at the time il Padiglione del Siam. The Siam Pavilion was built in the typical architecture of the area. And this is the Hungarian Pavilion. I'll have more to say of this pavilion later on, but the Hungarian Pavilion too was an exception in the sense that it was built by Hungarian architects according to architectural norms that were meant to reproduce the standards and the history of Hungary. This is one of the little boats that were bringing people back and forth from one side to the other of the Po River. And these are some details of the many, many buildings. Once again, beautiful view, this time from the river of the Hungarian Pavilion under construction. And this is a more conventional view instead of the Turinese Baroque pavilions and one of the main bridges that connected, this is the monumental bridge. It's a main bridge that connected one side to the other of the exhibition. Oh, no, we're going on. Turin, the first capital city of Italy. Turin took it upon itself to spearhead this grand exhibition that would be devoted to the concept of the unification of Italy as a united country. Well, that didn't last long. As soon as this started, I want to go back. As soon as this started, Rome intervened and said, what do you mean? What do you mean Turin is going to host the exhibition? Rome is the capital city of Italy. We should have a say in the exhibition. Furious and frenzied conversation ensued. And at the end, the two mayors of the city of Rome and Turin, Mayor Nathan and Frola, Nathan in Italian and Frola, decided that they would indeed share the honor of the World Fairs. And there is a pretty flowery description here of how they came to that. The metropolis of strong and industrious Piedmont is charged with gathering the various expressions of economic activity in an international industrial exposition. Rome, beacon of Italian thought, is charged with summarizing the idea that inspired those economic activities in its historical, patriotic, and artistic exhibits. Wow, quite a rhetorical flight here, pretty opaque actually, to tell us, well, we're gonna both do the same thing. We're gonna both be in charge of the exposition, and here a sort of a visual rendition of that agreement with the personification of Italy, holding hands with the makers of the Italian unification, Garibaldi and Mazzini on the right side, Cavour and King Victor Emmanuel II on the other side, and then the two host cities coming together on the right side, background of Castel Sant'Angelo, Rome, the she-wolf, obviously the insignia of Rome, Senatus Populusque Romanus, and on the other side, of course, at the same level, Turin with Toro from Turin, the bull, and the background of the city of Turin. So all seems well, except that now we have two cities vying for the celebration of the unitary state. And but this is only the beginning, because of course, those of you who know the history of Italian unification, the first capital city was, of course, Turin, with the Savoy crown house there. But in its migration towards Rome, briefly, Florence was the capital city. And so Florence came about and said, well, what about us? After all, we deserve a place in the celebration of united Italy. And so furious and fierce discussions ensued. And at the end of the day, it was decided that three cities would host the celebration of united Italy. And here we have a visual rendition of that, slightly changed from the one before. This time, note that Rome has a central spot, and on its left and right, in ancillary positions, we have two young women representing Turin with the Toro at the bottom on the one hand, and Florence on the other. Backgrounds, again, landscape of Turin on one side and on Florence with the Ponte Vecchio on the other. Florence was charged with the representation, with a number of exhibits, some devoted to portraits. You can see that the young woman is holding a portrait, and of botany and floriculture in general. What is meaningful, however, is that not only Rome is at the center here, but one of the key symbols of Italy is represented. This is the Vittoriano in Rome, which was dedicated to King Victor Emmanuel of Savoy, and it's greatly meaningful because it was meant to architecturally and artistically center the notion of Italian unification. So what happens next? Well, the decision was formally made that the three cities would host or would share the World Fair, but Turin went ahead. and created its own version of the Vittoriano. As you can see it here, this is the grand entrance to Turin 1911. This was called the Ponte Monumentale. This was a two-tiered bridge that ended in this building that kind of reproduces the features of the Vittoriano. The importance of architectural rendition to represent Italy was important at the time. I have a citation here that explains it. The third Italy, the Italy of the king and the people, has a character that must be consecrated not only in its institutions, but in the monuments that represent it. These monuments reflect the great efforts and high goals, the bravery and extensive learning by which we have been able to have the world recognize our national right. So there was a huge debate at the time about what should this national style be. And what Turin did in the 1911 exposition was attempt to create that style. And that style was based on the Turinese Baroque as designed during the Baroque era by architect Juvarra. So the probably the most representative example in Turin are the Basilica di Superga, as you can see here, and the other one is, of course, Palazzo Madama. So the idea here was really that of rendering the sense of religious and political power as on stage for everybody to see, for everybody to admire. And what the architects of the 1911 exhibition did was exactly that of creating a style that was reminiscent of Juvarra. It was the Turinese neo-Baroque. And as you can see, the architectural elements are mimic those that I've shown you. And the majority, as I said, the majority of the buildings were in the Turinese Baroque style. This is an example, the Padiglione della Città di Torino. But many of those buildings, again, were intended in this particular style, which had been owned and reproduced by in the city of Turin by architect Juvarra during the Baroque era. As I said earlier, none of these buildings still exist, still stand. They were all destroyed. What we had were photographs, postcards, articles in magazines that reproduced or described these pavilions. We knew the name of the architects, and we were enormously fortunate to be able to identify the architectural designs from one of these architects. His last name was Molli. We found them in a farmhouse about an hour and a half away from Turin. It was a phenomenal find. We found about 500 drawings of the pavilions in Turin 1911. We were able to borrow them. Some of them are very, very large, more than 5 meters in length. We were able to borrow them, to bring them to the Politecnico di Torino, and we were able to use various technologies to scan them and digitize them. Obviously, they don't fit in a regular scanner. You would need a giant scanner, so we had to use alternative methods to scan and digitize all of all of these architectural drawings. So then we were able to work from all the various archival materials we had that I described to reproduce and begin the 3D reconstruction of these buildings. So, as I mentioned, the decision was made to have the majority of the buildings in Turin 1911 reproduce the style that I called the Turinese Baroque. And the idea was very explicit, to create and in fact impose the Turinese Baroque as the national style, the style of United Italy, and a style that obviously was meant to vie, to compete with anything that Rome would propose. So nothing had to do with the Baroque of southern Italy, nothing to do with the Rome of Bramante, but rather the Juvara Baroque as the language of United Italy, of national Italy. Whether this succeeded or not is questionable. Of course, Italy went in another direction, and we know what happened during the fascist regime and what kind of style was, albeit briefly, unfortunately, the national style then. Turin, in a way, failed to impose the Turin Baroque as the national style. They attempted to do it during Turin 1911. Then the buildings were dismantled, and that became history in the sense that nobody would think either in 1920, the 30s, the 40s would have been identified the Turinese Baroque as the national style. It was an attempt. So, this is, I wanted to give you an idea of the drawings that we found in the Molly archive. This is just one example of many, many, many drawings that we were so fortunate to find. But then I want to go to talk to you a little bit about the Eccentric Pavilion. So the Pavilion of Hungary was considered the Eccentric Pavilion because it stood apart from anything clearly in the Turinese Baroque. Hungary made it a point to choose to build its own pavilion. Now, France, the United States, England, they had all agreed to go with the flow and build and let architects Molly create the pavilion in the Turinese Baroque style. A number of countries did not, and Hungary was one of them. And this is what they created. Immediately, the pavilion was hailed as a marvel. This is again a quotation from the Times, an article in a magazine. The architectonic features of the Hungarian pavilion make it completely stand out from all other buildings. Highly steeped roofs, white decorative obelisks, maiolic ornamentation with distinctive chromatic features tell us about the absolutely exotic character of this building. So the building was certainly presented as unique, and the term exotic was being used extensively. It was called Attila, you say in English, right? Attila's Tent Palace. The conical shape of the main structure, as you can see here, the big one and then the two smaller ones, they were meant to replicate the form of tents of the original inhabitants of the Hungarian territories. And the creation of this exotic narrative was meant for Hungary to assert itself over the other half of the empire, Austria, by center staging Hungarianness as something separate and different from the rest of Europe, and pointing towards the east rather than Austria. So Austria I mentioned it earlier in previous World Fairs. Austria had been both a host of World Fairs and participant in World Fairs, and really the typical architectural language of these countries was the Baroque, was basically Central European and the Baroque in general. But clearly, Hungary made a different decision here, and it was meant to separate itself from the rest of Europe and tell a story that was really a narrative of origin. The Hungarian Pavilion was intended to tell a foundational tale of ancestral tribes of warring horsemen who arrived from Asia to conquer Central Europe in the 9th century. It took its form in the creation of an architecture that was solely and uniquely Hungarian against Austrian hegemony. They were talking about a language of myth in Hungary that emerged in 1890s, but its impetus became even earlier with the creation of Hungarian national style. So similar intents, Italy trying to create a national style around not the Baroque, but around the Turinese Baroque as a sub-language of the overall Baroque language of the World Fairs. Hungary instead creating a completely different language around this so-called exotic pavilion that had nothing to do with the Hungarian language of the rest of the exhibition. Here we have a chromatic rendition of the pavilion, and you just try to imagine how it would have stood out in the Bianca Valentina. The rest of the exhibition is this triumph of white, and here instead we have mostly orange, ochre, and green as the main colors of the Hungarian Pavilion. I gave you a couple of examples from the documents that we have been able to retrieve. This is an aquarello by one of the architects of the Hungarian Pavilion. So the pavilion had a certain military tone. This is the entrance to the pavilion. There are 7 helmeted warriors with swords protecting the entrance of King Attila's palace. Now, Attila was certainly part of the European collective imagination. Any school-age child in Turin would have probably have learned about the fearsome king of the Huns, we'll call il flagello di Dio, the scourge of God, the larger-than-life leader, who was, and I quote, glorious in his life, invincible in death, the father of his people, the scourge of his enemies, and the terror of the world. So this is the kind of narrative that was being developed and at the time. But by naming the pavilion after Attila, the Hungarians committee really played upon some of the cliches of all the world fairs. The power of immediate and popular recognition. Everybody going in the fair, all the fair goers had some kind of mental image about Attila, and the seductiveness of the exotic barbarian other. And so the exposition of 1911 did similar things. Turin and Hungary were doing similar things, although the pavilions have been represented as such polar opposites. The narrative underneath them was exactly the same. The attempt to create a national style that would separate Hungary from Austria on the one hand, and Turin from Rome on the other. So in this context, I think it becomes clear why Hungary would not join the Baroque renditions of Turin 1911, but separate itself at the same time from both Turin and Vienna, just like Turin was separating itself from Rome and the rest of Italy. So here, two posters to a little bit conclude my case study. The Hungarian Pavilion on the left with its melody of color and shape, and on the other, the monochromatic rendition of the Bianca Valentina and the Turin Baroque Pavilion, two completely different languages meant to tell a very similar story, a story of national creation and national identity, the attempt of Hungary to set itself free from the dual monarchy and Austria on one side, and Turin, the attempt to recreate its notion of capitalhood in a time where the capital was being moved to Rome. Turin wanted to present itself as the new capital of Italy, maybe not the political capital, but the capital of labor, as it expressed itself or defined itself in 1911. The next slide is part of a PhD dissertation from one of our students at the Politecnico di Torino, and it is a way to show how the different archival material come together towards the creation of the 3D reconstruction of the pavilion of Hungary, and how this all again is used by us to try and understand the age that produced Turin 1911 and this exhibition. So let's see if I can get it started.
Buongiorno.
I'm not gonna, the narrative is in Italian, so and he does a great job, but I think I'll have to stand in and interpret it a little bit for him. So this is the map that I was telling you I was trying to bring to life when I was dissatisfied with what a book could do, as opposed to a broader and larger digital project. This just identifies some of the areas in the pavilions that we have reconstructed in 3D. Here we have some artifacts of the time that helped us rebuild the exhibition. And here we go. This is the beginning of the 3D reconstruction of the Hungarian Pavilion. This is Padiglione della Città di Torino and its 3D reconstruction, which will allow eventually fairgoers to move and visit the pavilion. Some of them only the exterior, but a few exhibits in the interiors that we have been able to find materials for. We are planning to reproduce that too. Here we go, how it would have looked from the River Po. The next phase will be that of I re-identified the original colors from images, and mostly artworks, watercolors that we have, and narrative descriptions of how the pavilion looked. We know for a fact that there was ochre and green were the main colors of that pavilion. So we are juxtaposing various documents, postcards, documentaries, film, cinematic renditions, architectural drawings. All of these came together in the 3D reconstruction our engineers and architects did. As you can see, these buildings were massive. And this was the Castello della Cascata, again, the main bridge that brought fairgoers into the exposition. There was a lower level with a tapis roulant and an upper level. And this is the Cascata delle Acque from Molly's drawing and our 3D reconstruction, which was meant to reappropriate the Vittoriano in Rome and reproduce it as a Turin Baroque monument. So basically bringing it away from Rome and replacing it in Turin with a Turinese language. This is again part of one of the documentaries we found at the Museo del Cinema. These are all materials that were often not even cataloged. So it was a massive endeavor trying to find, and there's a lot of stuff that we may still need to recover. So it's a work in progress. It was, as you can imagine, drastically delayed by COVID. Let's see. But I just came back from Turin last week, and we have been able